Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Just going to give it a few seconds so everyone can get on. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're just giving it a few seconds for everyone to join. Okay. Awesome. Well, hi everyone. I'm Dana. I am the Government Relations Director with the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project. We're so thankful that you guys are all spending part of your evening with us to talk about the Nakba. And we have some amazing guests on the line today, but this is also being co-hosted by Americans for Justice in Palestine Action and U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights Action. And we have two lovely ladies from those organizations on the line with us today. We have Iman from USPCR and Aya from AJP Action. And then we have two additional wonderful guests. We have Yousef Munayyer, who is the head of Palestine Israel program and senior fellow at the Arab Center. And then Congresswoman Tlaib, who needs no other introduction other than that. I know everyone on the call is really excited to hear from her. So we'll turn it over to her right now. But also just want to say, Congresswoman, we are all so lucky to have your voice representing us all in Congress. And we know things like a Nakba resolution would never have been possible or ever even imaginable had you not been there. So thank you for not only representing your district so well, but all Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans in this country. You're truly a voice for so many, and we're just infinitely lucky to have you there. And so fortunate that you can spend a few moments of your evening with us tonight. And we know you have votes to get to, so we'll just turn to you right now.
No, thank you so much, Dana, and thank you so much for everybody that's been part of this incredible movement to not liberate only Palestine, but really humanize the struggle that of human rights violations, the genocide, and so much more that we've experienced these last few years. But one of the things that I have realized early on and why the Nakba resolution is so incredibly important in the Institute of Middle Eastern IMEU understands is that we've always been told, you don't understand the history. And I, as a member of Congress, has been told by other colleagues that same line, you don't understand our history. And it was very important that we did something historic, something to uplift the history of the Palestinian people. And this Friday will mark the 78th anniversary of the Nakba. And that's 78 years of ethnic cleansing, 78 years of forced displacement and exile of Palestinian refugees who still have the keys to their homes awaiting their chance to finally return home. And so tomorrow, again, I'll be reintroducing the congressional resolution to recognize the ongoing Nakba and the right of Palestinian refugees to return home. The Nakba never ended, and many of us have been talking about that and understanding the importance of saying that and being, again, unapologetic about claiming the truth. When I say the Nakba never ended, it's because we see it every single day. In the Israeli apartheid regime's ongoing genocide in Gaza and the accelerating erasure of Palestinian communities across the West Bank in Jerusalem, in the mass, confiscation of lands and communities, and the targeted bombings of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, all across Palestine, the Israeli government's goal is the same, controlling the maximum amount of land with the fewest number of Palestinians. This was the case in 1948 and still the case today. Too many of my colleagues in Congress like to act like if the state violence against the Palestinian people began with Netanyahu, but we know our history. We know that Palestinian history has been one of the ongoing Nakba and an ethnic cleansing campaign since the creation in 1948. We know that 75% of indigenous population of Palestinians was ethnically cleansed, displaced from their homes by Zionist militias and the Israeli army between 1947 to 1949, with hundreds of cities and villages depopulated and demoed. I went to a park when I was a young girl and I saw steps to homes that weren't there anymore and realized this wasn't a park, it was actually a neighborhood that was erased from the map. We know that Palestinians have faced massacres at the hands of these forces in communities like Deir Yassin. We know that the genocide in Gaza today and the apartheid system that the Palestinian people live with all across Palestine is the continuation of the same long settler colonial process, really a campaign that continues to move forward with such violence and such aggression. But I want you to think about this for a second. Around 70% of the entire population of Gaza right now are refugees from the 1948 Nakba, denied their right to return home for decades, only to then live through this genocide and see their community destroyed and be displaced again, even multiple times. We've seen the stories of people saying, not again, yet it is happening. This is why it is so urgent that we not only speak out against today's genocide of the Palestinian people, but place it within its proper historical context as part of the ongoing Nakba. I'm proud that this year we have more co-sponsors on the congressional resolution than we've ever had before, and our numbers just keep growing. And that's because of the work of IMEU and so many partners, US CPR, so many organizations that continue to push back, from the Nakba 48 project, all those amazing, incredible stories coming to light for the first time ever. And I know that the American people are seeing this genocide now, armed and backed by our own government, that they are learning this history, that there is no going back from, again, people knowing the truth. The tide is turning and elected officials are finally catching up, even though they're slow as hell. But the situation is extremely dire, and we need immediate action now. As we speak today, I want people that are listening to know the genocidal government of Israel is currently demoing right now the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Silwan and expelling the people that have been there, and literally to build a biblical theme park. The Israeli Knesset passed a disgusting law mandating the mass execution of Palestinian prisoners by hanging and further enriching racist apartheid rule. And we see the continued expanding the Nakba beyond Palestine and into Lebanon, using the same genocidal playbook to erase centuries-old towns and wipe out entire families. This will not stop until we end the US support for this genocidal apartheid government. We need to enforce the Genocide Convention and hold its perpetrators accountable. We all know, and we've been saying it loud and clear, that we need an arms embargo, we need mass boycotts, we need sanctions. These actions help bring the end of the apartheid in South Africa, and they can help end apartheid in Palestine today. Our country, United States, is the primary sponsor of this ongoing Nakba, and just as it was the primary sponsor of apartheid in South Africa. We have a duty here in the United States to speak out, to exercise our First Amendment right, to do everything in our power to end the complicity of these mass atrocities. And I know it is extremely difficult to maintain hope with all this death and destruction surrounding us. But at the end, an end to the apartheid is possible. I see it already when the majority of Americans across the country are with us. People that do not share my faith, ethnicity, are saying loud and clear in this genocide, in the funding. That's why many are desperately working to dismantle UNRWA and demolish refugee camps in Jenin and Gaza and in Lebanon. They want to erase the possibility of return because, again, the tide is turning. But we have to continue to fight back for the right to return. It's a right. It's not negotiable. It is deeply enshrined in international law in the hearts of Palestinian families worldwide. So I'll continue to fight back against this erasure, and I hope that the resolution brings us one step closer to the end of the ongoing Nakba in Palestine, but also to be able to tell our history with our own words, with our own truth. And so again, thank you so much to the incredible advocacy groups. You all give credibility to voices like mine, but really many, many people across the country that are speaking very loudly, very clearly about the right for Palestinians to live and the right for them to have human rights. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and congratulations again on introducing it this year with a record number of co-sponsors. It's really stunning to see every single time more and more support, and it's really, really appreciated. So thank you for your work and the work of your staff. And you touched on a very important point about a lot of people in America now are understanding the struggle of Palestinians for the first time, but unfortunately, too often they're understanding it only in the context of post-October 7th and not starting the story where we all know the story starts, right? So, Yousef, we're so happy to have you on the call today and hoping you can help take us back to when this all began in the late 1940s. And can you tell us a little bit more about the history in those years?
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks so much for including me in this conversation. And I really appreciate all the words that the Congresswoman had to share with us, the efforts that she's making to raise awareness about these issues, and for the efforts of everyone else on the call as well. We can talk about the 1940s, and obviously this is a very important moment when we talk about the Nakba, but in all reality, the moment of the Nakba from 1947 to 1949 is something that became possible because a lot of groundwork was laid for it before that. And I think it is impossible to imagine the Nakba happening the way that it did during that time period without, for example, the end of the British Mandate, without, for example, the massive repression of the Great Revolt from 1936 to 1939, without the policies of the British imperial government in supporting the Zionist movement and the massive influx of Zionist immigrants into Palestine in the 1920s and in the 1930s, and without the Balfour Declaration, and so on. So there are a lot of historical moments that really laid the groundwork for the events of 1947 to 1949, during which the vast majority of the native inhabitants of Palestine were forced from their homes, where upwards of 500 Palestinian towns and villages were depopulated, most of which were razed to the ground, and during which some 800,000 Palestinians, which today the descendants of whom number many millions more, were forced from their homes never to return. So when we think about that moment, from 1947 to 1949, it's important to remember that that became possible because of the different steps that were taken beforehand. And all of that historical context is important. When we talk specifically, though, about the period of 1947 to 1949, I think there are some things that, and I assume that there are a lot of people on this call that already have a good understanding of the events of that time. And oftentimes, as Palestinians, we refer to the year of 1948, and for good reason. But really, when we talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and there have been some really amazing historical works that have documented the actual tick-tock of events on every Palestinian village that was depopulated during this process. It really starts in November of 1947, after the UN General Assembly resolution is passed that kind of calls for a partition of Palestine against the will, of course, of the native inhabitants of the land. And from the initial sort of phases of the ethnic cleansing, from November of 1947 through the early part of 1948, the first few months of 1948, we largely see skirmishes in and around the areas where there are major Jewish populations inside of Palestine. And it is not until the spring of 1948, mid-March of 1948, where we begin to see a real expansion in Zionist conquest operations that begin to then go beyond the areas in which the Jewish population is located in Palestine, had settled up through that point, but begin then to take on and take over towns and villages and areas that were, of course, populated by Palestinian Arabs. And so from the period of, mid-March 1948 until May 14th, 1948. And this is something that many people don't quite know or recognize or appreciate. There's a huge amount of actual depopulation, ethnic cleansing that takes place during that month and a half, 2 month period. from mid-March to mid-May 1948, prior to the end of the British Mandate, prior to the declaration of the State of Israel, and prior to the mobilization of Arab armies into Palestine and the onset of the first sort of Arab-Israeli war. So in that period, you have, by May 14th, 1948, close to 400,000 Palestinian refugees are already created because of Zionist conquest operations. If you think about that, that's half of the total number of refugees that would be created during the entire period. The vast majority of that half is created during that 2 month period. From mid-March to mid-May of 1948, again before that the Arab-Israeli war begins. Some 200 plus villages, towns, Palestinian localities are depopulated by that point and during that period. So there is a huge spike in the process of ethnic cleansing in the spring of 1948, before even the State of Israel is declared. After, of course, the State of Israel is declared and the British Mandate ends, that process continues. But so much ethnic cleansing had already taken place. The largest Palestinian towns, Jaffa, Haifa, good parts of Jerusalem, had already been attacked and depopulated prior to May 14th of 1948. The ethnic cleansing, of course, continues after that, deeper into the interior of Palestine, with more towns and villages that are affected. Ultimately, by the end of it, after the last armistice agreement in 1949, we reached the numbers of 800,000 and some 500 villages depopulated. But there's that huge spike in the spring of 1948 that I think is really, really, really important. And the sequence of events there are really important to recognize, because this is, of course, before even Israel is declared and before even the war begins. So much of the so-called Nakba narrative that we hear in the West describes the Palestinian refugee, quote, problem as a product of the Arab-Israeli war and the invasion of Arab armies. But the history tells us, and the sequence of events tells us, that actually the invasion of Arab armies are a response to the mass ethnic cleansing of Palestine that is already underway in the spring of 1948. And that is an ethnic cleansing that continues not because of that invasion, but prior to it. That process was already underway. So, I think perhaps maybe I'll stop there with that sort of basic outline of the events during that time, and we can go from there.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And can you tell us a little bit more about why we commemorate Nakba Day on the 15th?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question. I think there are probably a few different reasons why. One of them, I think, is part of what I just laid out. You have up until this point, I think it's fair to say that much of Palestine was lost already at that point. So really the height of the Nakba in terms of the scale and the pace of the depopulation is more concentrated in that 2 month period than probably any other 2 month period throughout the entirety of the 1947 to 1949 war. So, much of the die of the Nakba is cast by mid-May of 1948. You have also, of course, the fact that the British Mandate ends and the Israeli state is declared during this period, which really solidifies the policies of ethnic cleansing. At least during the mandate, there was for a long time, a balancing in British policy, an attempt to sort of appease both sides. With the formal end of that mandate and the creation of the Israeli state, it became clear that the policies of ethnic cleansing would continue to be supported and expanded. And that reality is one I think that is important to reflect on at that time. So all of those things, I think, together. Remember, these are a series of events that happen over a period of many months. And so this is really the pinnacle of it in this moment. And that's, I think, the reason why this date becomes the focal point. But there are so many moments throughout this timeline that are crucial. The massacres at Deir Yassin, for example, which happened in early April of that year, are a huge catalyst in the ethnic cleansing. The announcement of the United States that they were backing away from the partition plan in mid March of 1948, and then the switch over to conquest operations by the Zionist militias. Really important moments in this timeline. The siege of Jerusalem, the bombing of Jaffa. These are really crucial moments, all of which are microcosms of the broader story itself. And I think because of that, that moment on May 15th becomes a moment where it ties so much of this bigger story together.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And you did such a good job of laying out why this is more than just one day. We commemorate it on a day every year, but this is a process over time. It's took years and years and frankly is ongoing, as we all are well aware. And thank you for all of that background. It's really helpful when explaining to other folks why commemorating the Nakba is so important and why we cannot lose sight of that historical context because it brings everything that we are all witnessing today into perspective. And again, this is an ongoing Nakba, right? And I know, Yousef, you've talked about this before, but tell us a little bit more, in your words, why that is significant and why Palestinians refer to it as ongoing.
Yeah, I think as I said, there's something very important about recognizing this historical moment that we are talking about from 1947 to 1949 because it is such a high point in this process. Um, but this process is one that began long before 1948 and continues through this day. This process of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine did not start in 1948. We discussed this a little bit at the outset, but actually, Palestinians have experienced loss of control over land that they were farming, that they were living in for many decades prior to 1948 because of a wide range of policies, both British imperial policies and Zionist policies, which contributed to this prior to the ethnic cleansing. But the ethnic cleansing of Palestine from 1947 to 1949 represents the highest singular moment of this. Two-thirds of the native inhabitants of the population of Palestine are forced out of Palestine. This is a major rupture, which really is unlike any other, and a major turning point in the history of the Palestinian people. And I think we can talk about this process over time, different episodes of it, the various different policies which enable the continued ethnic cleansing. Congresswoman began talking about the situation in East Jerusalem today, where we are seeing this, the horrific settler violence, which is targeting Palestinians in towns and villages throughout the West Bank. Today is forcing people off their lands and out of their homes. The genocide that has taken place in Gaza, all of these are extensions of this process, which continue to unfold today. But the Nakba in 1948 is a very, very high moment of this process. And I would argue the genocide in Gaza that we are witnessing is another moment of extreme ethnic cleansing and violence that is another high moment in this process as well.
Thank you. And I think we had a question. Somebody asked to repeat the number of towns that were depopulated.
Yeah, so the precise number, I want to say it's in the range of 520. I would refer you to there's been a lot of historical work on this. The most comprehensive effort that I've seen, which has actually tried to aggregate as many of the historical works as possible and then contribute a lot of original work around the depopulation of Bedouin localities in the Naqab in the southern part of Palestine is the work of Salman Abu Sitta in his cartographic works and atlases. that cover these periods. And he does a really fantastic job of kind of mapping out during each stage of this process the different Zionist conquest operations, the different towns and villages that are targeted, the number of refugees that are created in each and every one of these towns across the entire period. And I believe where he settles is somewhere between 520 and 530 depopulated Palestinian localities and over 800,000 Palestinian refugees. And he arrives at these numbers by bringing together lots of different historical works in an aggregated database and contributing his own documentation as well.
Thank you. Um, and again, we want to talk about this in the context of today, in addition to the context of the 1940s. So thank you, Yousef, for giving us such a helpful historical overview. But to go back to the ongoing Nakba that we mentioned, Palestinians today, as everyone on this call knows and everyone listening is probably well aware, experience a lot of um, these struggles still today. And Iman, I know you have family in the West Bank, and I know you want to share a little bit more about what your family is experiencing now.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks, Yousef, for all the historical context here, and thanks to everyone who's joining us. So interestingly enough, I was actually born on the Nakba, so to be grounded in this every single year in such a way, it's just it's a reawakening in every single year I'm alive and witnessing. And it's funny because, well, funny but not funny, but the Nakba to my family has never been at one point in time, right? Like we commemorate on one day. But it is seen as Dana, you're sharing is this continuation of the ongoing ethnic cleansing, the ongoing displacement of our people. And so parts of what had happened early on during the beginning years of the Nakba, my family did deal directly with being forced into exile. So we had actually uncles of my mother, of whom were in the West Bank, were forced out of their homes, not immediately displaced, but were actually arrested and detained and tortured before they were actually then exiled into Amman, where they were actually, interestingly enough, met again with IOF forces that ambushed them upon their arrival in Amman. And so these Zionist, forces kind of followed through. This exile had followed through. The Zionist forces followed kind of through into this exile, and it's just an interesting story. Every year, I learn more about what my family entails, and the transparent thing too is Zionism itself does not make it easy for us to be able to pinpoint the exact stories at times. And some of these, like especially with documentation and all these sorts of things, it's extremely difficult for some of our families to actually pinpoint exactly what may have happened. So a lot of our stories are shared through oral testimony, and making sure that we try our best to pass down the stories that we can to get to know as much as possible for our own families. And so that kind of started. But interestingly enough, my grandmother and my grandfather, again, of whom lived in the West Bank outside of the town of Ramallah, had seen a lot of the displacement happening around them, but actually did not lose their home. They were able to stay despite all the different forces and the pressures to be pushed away. They ended up staying. And so we have family who still remains in the West Bank as of today, despite the ongoing push out, the ongoing displacement, and all those sorts of things. And part of me has always understood the Nakba as not just, again, it's not just been about displacement. The Nakba to me isn't just about pushing someone out of their home. It's about the indirect pressures that the Zionist forces push against our families, push against our people to try their best to get them out of there as to the best of their abilities. And so I see the Nakba kind of showcased throughout my family to today, through the arbitrary detainment of my cousins, through the settler violence that is happening outside of the streets. I most recently have been hearing stories from my family of how once sunset hits, settlers come in and completely just rain terror across the village, doing everything that they can to just provoke this fear across the Palestinians that are living in their village. They're shutting down roads and making it extremely difficult to get essential needs, making sure that they get the healthcare access that they need. It's just almost they're imposing this slow death, this slow destruction against Palestinians to make living in Palestine as difficult as possible. And for any of these stories that I am naming that are particular to my family are actually shared among so many Palestinians of whom remain in the West Bank as of today. and even all throughout the region. And so I just carry it, I ground myself in it every single day, recognizing that the Nakba still continues to show up. And it's the absolute incredible steadfastness of our people that allow them to even remain in their homes, that allow us to be able to kind of tell these stories, the continuation of what's been ongoing. And my own family is a part of that. And so I appreciate the invitation to share a little bit about that. And I'll pass it back to you, Dana.
Thank you, man. And that is really so powerful. And we all know, that power behind storytelling, right? And sharing our voices. And a lot of people just don't even know a Palestinian to have that story shared and that personal insight. So thank you. That is really moving. Um, I want to spend a little bit of time on why it is relevant and important to recognize the Nakba, right? Like we know the historical context and we know, we all here acknowledge that it happened and continues to happen. But what is the significance behind a resolution like we're seeing in Congress now? Like, why is it important for members of Congress and other leaders in the United States and beyond to say, yes, the Nakba happened and we need to take accountability for that, for allowing that to happen? Yousef, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts there.
Well, look, I think it's important as a matter of sort of the position of the United States government to recognize the reality as it is, and to recognize the role that our government has played, and continues to play in creating this reality for Palestinians. And in truth, many years ago, I think United States governments had a much more honest, and clear understanding of what took place during the Nakba in 1948. It's gotten much worse over time as the American position has become far more identical to the sort of Zionist position, on the events, the historical events. But American governments in the early period after 1948 understood that there was a horrific refugee problem, that this is something that had to be dealt with, that what happened to Palestinians was wrong, that there needed to be some form of repatriation. And it really wasn't until the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, really, but the Kennedy administration was the last one that kind of pressed Israel at all on the refugee issue. And over time, as I said, the U.S. position has moved closer to the Zionist framing of history. So for all these reasons, it is a very necessary and important corrective, in our own policy, in our own understanding as Americans of what has taken place, for there to be some kind of federal government recognition of these events, and of course, beginning to recognize the wrongs is the first step towards adjusting policy in a way that fixes them, that brings some sort of approximation of justice. So it's a necessary first step in getting to where I think we all believe we should go.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one thing that the Congresswoman mentioned earlier is really powerful as well. And it's that we're seeing Israel expand this into other places, right? Like what we're seeing in southern Lebanon, is really, you're able to draw a lot of comparisons and it's really
Can I
scary.
just add something to that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about this as we were talking, and man was mentioning earlier, and the Congresswoman also mentioned, coming across a park and seeing steps and realizing that this wasn't a park or a forest or what have you, it was actually a neighborhood. And I think many of us Palestinians are familiar with the scenes and images of ruins of the towns of our grandparents and our great grandparents and so on. But what I think a lot of people don't know, or perhaps assume to be true, is that all of this destruction took place in 1948. The reality is there was massive depopulation, ethnic cleansing in 1948, but the actual physical razing of many of these structures takes place in the 1950s. And one of the things that the Israelis began to figure out, because they were confronting this problem, that all of these Palestinian refugees who had been forced from their homes, well, they were actually able to see their homes just across the border. And they kept attempting to come back. And during this period after 1948 in the 1950s, the Israeli military was killing many Palestinians who were attempting to just return to their homes because they could see their homes, they could see their lands. In many cases, there were family members who were separated across borders. They wanted to reconnect with their family members back in their homeland. And what the Israelis realized during this period is that so long as these homes are standing, these Palestinians are going to keep trying to come back. They're going to keep trying to come back on foot. So there was a massive project of raising the homes in Palestinian towns and villages that took place in the 1950s. And this is very much alive today in Israeli policy in Gaza and in Lebanon. The policy that we see being enacted today is a policy which aims to get rid of the population by ensuring that they have no homes to return to. This is why they have done in Gaza what they have done, destroying entire towns, bringing them to rubble. That's why they're doing in southern Lebanon what they're doing. Because if there are no homes, people can't come back, or so they think. And this policy stems directly from this period immediately after the Nakba. So it is so relevant and crucial for us today to wrestle with this history and recognize it for what it is because it hasn't left us. It's still with us and expanding every day.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And so another thing, why we are all gathered here today is because Congresswoman Tlaib, right? We are so fortunate that she's introduced this Nakba resolution on the Hill. And she's done this every year since she's been there. And this year, like we said, has historic support, but we need more. I think it's going to have 12 co-sponsors this year, or original co-sponsors this year, meaning they are on right when it's introduced, which is incredible. But that's not even like a small fraction of the number of House members, right? And so it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can to help support that mission. And Aya, I know that you are going to tell us a little bit more about what everyone on this call can do to help.
Yeah, thank you, Dana, and everybody for being here. Honestly, this conversation is so important. As I'm listening to everybody talk, it just reminds you how layered the conversation about the Nakba is, and even us as Palestinians on this call and doing this work, like how layered all of our experiences are, even being in the diaspora. So I'm just really glad that we're talking about this and digging into the history. And with that, I know that it could be like super overwhelming and daunting to commemorate 78 years since the Nakba, while we're also simultaneously like witnessing the continuation of ethnic cleansing and settler colonial expansion and mass displacement and a full-fledged genocide against Palestinians in real time in the most documented way that we've ever experienced it. So it's easy to feel hopeless in moments like this, but I think it's also really important to recognize that sustained organizing and advocacy have shifted the political landscape in ways that have seemed possible even years ago. And I think like all of us on this call can attest to that, having been in this work for as long as we have. I think for me, I would have never imagined that we would have the historic support or the public shift of opinion the way that we do today. And so before I share some of the actions that you can all take, I just want to highlight some of the wins that we've achieved over the last several years. And there's four things that stand out to me in particular that you might already know or might be new to you. But number one, it's that the percentage of Americans who view Israel negatively has risen to nearly 60% in 2026. Two, it's that a growing number of Americans now sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israel. Three, it's that recently a record-breaking number of 40 US senators voted in support of blocking weapons sales to Israel through joint resolutions of disapproval. That is huge if you know anything about the Senate. And then four, a record-breaking 69 members of Congress have now co-sponsored Rep. Delia Ramirez's Block the Bombs Act to halt US weapons transfers to Israel. These are really profound structural shifts, and I know that sometimes it feels like our work is moving really slowly and quietly, but I want to acknowledge how profound this is. And they happened because Palestinians have continued resisting displacement and erasure and apartheid despite unimaginable violence and loss. Like we heard from Yousef the true history behind the Nakba, and yet Palestinians persist on the ground. And it also happened because people across our country here in the US have organized relentlessly in their communities and on campuses and in the streets and in the halls of Congress. And so I just want to remind everybody that every call made and every rally organized, every meeting you have with your lawmaker, every protest, every teach-in and advocacy day, and every act of pressure has helped move this issue further into the public consciousness and forced every elected official to respond, whether it's quietly or, we don't know what some of them are thinking between themselves, but I know that it's forced everybody to grapple with this. And so what once felt politically untouchable is now being openly challenged at the highest levels of government and by both parties at this point. Um, and going back to the question of why it's important to talk about the Nakba today, I think this is why getting every member of Congress to formally recognize the Nakba is so crucial, because for decades, Palestinians have been denied even the basic acknowledgement of the mass displacement, dispossession, and violence that has shaped their reality and continues to until this very day. So recognition matters because it challenges decades of historical erasure and forces these elected officials that continue to support the continuation of our exile and our ethnic cleansing today to publicly confront the root causes of Palestinian suffering instead of treating the violence as something that began in a vacuum, as we see happen often with the conversation of October 7th. Until today, almost 3 years into the genocide, the conversation has started with October 7th as if that's where the story started, and we know very well that it didn't. So, all that to say, we have to continue transforming, growing this public awareness into concrete political action and policy change, which is why it's layered in two parts. One, continuing to have these conversations and talk about it and educate people. And then two is turn it into policy change. So we can continue doing that by two things. If you haven't yet contacted your member of Congress and they're not on Rep Tlaib's Nakba resolution, you can urge them to sign on and co-sponsor. And I think the link is going to be dropped in the chat. And then additionally, for the Block the Bombs Act, we're still trying to get as many co-sponsors as possible. We've already broken a record and we want to continue to break it. So if your member is also not there, you can check on blockthebombs.org. And if they're not, you can reach out to them there and ask them to co-sponsor. And on top of that, just continue organizing in our communities, continue to attend local actions, continue to educate your families, your friends, your coworkers, whatever it might be, and just continue showing up for Palestine in civic engagement because that is actually so crucial.
Thank you, Aya. That is really powerful, and I think it's so nice to hear all of those successes and all of that progress that we've made together as a community. And I know we have so many people on the call today, and I want to thank all of you for your engagement and for being a part of that movement because, our voices matter, and we wouldn't see that change if it wasn't for the public pressure, and everyone collectively speaking out in the fight for Palestinian rights. So thank you everyone on the call. And I guess if you're going to take a few high level takeaways, exactly what Aya said, Josh just dropped the links in the chat for you to contact your members and highlight those bills. But also, talk about the Nakba and talk about the historical context, and don't let people start the story 2 years ago. We all know the truth. We all know the systemic oppression, apartheid that Palestinians have been living through on a daily basis, and everyone has a role to play in making sure we correct the record on where this conversation should be starting. So I want to thank our speakers. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to be on this call. Thank you for your voices, and I think it's really important to note the Palestinian power on this call as well. It's so nice to be in such good camaraderie with fellow Palestinian Americans. So thank you guys for your time, and thank you again, everyone, for joining. And we'll talk to you all soon. Bye.